I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com. Now, for me, this is the classic story, which would represent the phrase "in like a lion, out like a lamb."
Right.
So if we bring ourselves back to the release of Gerry Hutch from custody, his acquittal for the murder of David Byrne, and obviously there was the spectacle on the streets outside the courts, and Hutch ended up hopping into a taxi and going down home. He'd later tell us that he actually went to visit a few people before he headed back to his house in Clontarf, where there was an ease upheld that night. And in the days that followed, this big story broke that a GSOC officer who had been investigating some... he was investigating what?
Well, he was an investigator. I don't know if he was. I don't think he was specifically linked to any case involving Gerry Hutch.
But he was investigating. He had access, it was said at the time, to the Regency hotel files.
Yeah.
And this was the big kind of, scandal. So this man, who was a former policeman himself from his own country, was living in Ireland, was working for GSOC, and he attended this knees up. He later would say he actually just went in briefly to collect somebody else. It also emerged that he was a neighbour of Hutch's in Clontarf. And there was huge sort of scandal around this, what had been going on in the background. The Gardaí were brought in to investigate if there was anything untoward. Remember, the big story was that this guy might have had access to the Regency file and Pulse. And I was going, well, Hutch had access to the Regency file. He was handed the book of evidence. He had it for months behind bars as he awaited the trial. And Pulse, I don't know if really Pulse is of a huge amount of value too. Is it?
Well, it probably is of some value for sure. I mean, I suppose it was during the Regency trial, there were these massive stories kept emerging. Like the first one was Jonathan Dowdall was going to be state witness.
Yeah.
That was only confirmed then.
Yeah.
And then there were loads of other things like the where the guards were brought back in to justify the recording it during
in the north.
So there was this constant stream of stories. This was the big one after it. What had happened was that this officer, the GSOC officer, who's not from Ireland originally, often GSOC have employed former police officers from other jurisdictions, similar jurisdictions, who maybe have completed their service and then they end up working for GSOC. And he wasn't from Ireland, but he'd obviously been living here and had rented a house from a woman, a pensioner, who was living in Clontarf. He had rented a room in her home, basically, while working for GSOC. Now, she was just a neighbour of Gerry Hutch. Obviously, Gerry Hutch is living in Clontarf. He's living in an estate with no other criminals, but people know him over the many years that he's lived there. And when he was acquitted, this woman, this pensioner, had gone along to the party. And the GSOC officer had obviously either collected her or brought her, and it somehow ended up in the house. And that was his explanation. Then, bizarrely, he seems to have come into the office and rather than being ratted up by some secret deep-throat informer, he seemed to have informed people himself that he'd been there. And obviously, that's raised alarm bells in GSOC, who then referred the case themselves to the Gardaí. And he was arrested. Now, in the background of all of these things, now, we've obviously heard today that there is no prosecution to be brought to DPP.
Thus my out like a lamb.
Yes. So the guards released a statement very much lacking in detail, just saying a man in the 60s is not to be charged after a file had gone to the DPP. Because clearly the suspicion was that the Hutch organised crime gangs links to the Gardaí and information. That's a long-term investigation for the Gardaí. We know some of that centres around John Spud Murphy, a former Garda officer. So obviously the guards went in.
Most of the suspicions surround the fact that when there was a warrant issued for Gerry Hutch's arrest, Gerry Hutch couldn't have not discovered that because it was posted on social media.
Yeah.
And this was a top secret piece of information. The Gardaí here were hoping that they could move on him with the help of their Spanish counterparts in Lanzarote, where they knew where he was.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, he had flown to Spain for a holiday and was due back. They were waiting for him at the airport, either in Spain or the other side in Lanzarote, and he never showed up. And he had kind of gone to ground then.
Yeah.
And I think he would have later told us during our chat with him that he was always going to hand himself in, but he didn't particularly want to have to sit in custody in the run-up to the trial. So he was just hanging out in Spain, basically.
Yeah.
And he was arrested there, actually, by police while he was in a restaurant at a meal.
In Fungarola, wasn't it? So what happened was, once this arrest warrant is issued, and obviously they wanted to keep it top secret, arrest them, and then put out in a blaze of publicity. But instead, it started to appear on a Hutch associated Twitter page,
an anonymous
one, but clearly a Hutch
aligned,
Hutch aligned page. So this sparked a huge investigation because there was a belief that this could only have come from within the Gardaí, or there certainly was a huge degree of suspicion. I suppose other people could have known it, other professionals of the state. So obviously this GSOC officer appearing at his hoolie as he gets out would have sparked suspicions. But there was always another sort of narrative about this GSOC officer, who I believe has left the country, resigned from GSOC and left the country a long time ago. There was always another narrative that this guy was no criminal sort of mastermind, that he was more hapless and...
Well, clearly that's what the DPP is of the opinion, that there's no prosecution being brought, there's no charges being brought.
Yeah.
He has no case to answer.
No.
So clearly what his explanation was believed. There was no criminal offending discovered.
No.
And that investigation, which has now gone on for what, 2 years?
2 years,
what sort of resources went into that?
Yeah, possibly more than 2 years. But I suppose they have to investigate. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, he was arrested. But there's no exactly. There was always the other narrative that he was more hapless. A bit of a, he was over here living on his own, obviously in a rented room, was out at night. A bit of a loose end. And he arrived at this moment. So he certainly landed himself in a lot of trouble, really. But
for sure. Anyway, so that's the end of that one.
Yeah,
we'll move on.
Yeah, and of course there is another longer term investigation into the ties between the Hutch organised crime group and suspicions that they were receiving information from the Gardaí, and that is ongoing, and that again is taking a long time. And what the final outcome of that is, we're still not clear. But this guy doesn't.
Is John Spud Murphy still in custody at this point?
John Spud Murphy, our last story had him. He had been in Shelton Abbey. He had been. On his way out, I suppose, and Shelton Abbey is very easy sort of going prison where, you're allowed to have a mobile phone, you move around, you're not restricted to a cell, but he had got temporary release, and somebody had reported that he'd been drinking away in the local pub, which he didn't get temporary release to do.
In his local pub in Malahide.
In Malahide, and so he was brought back into prison. That's the last we've heard of him. I believe he's still in Wheatfield. He probably will get back into an open prison at some stage if he abides by the rules. So his sentence probably, look, I'm not exactly sure on the specific date, but it will be coming to an end if he gets that standard remission, which he probably still would apply to him, despite the incident in the pub.
Interesting.
Yes.
No doubt we'll be talking about him again anyway.
We will.
Okay, Noel, thank you so much.
Thank Nicola.